The first time Eliza Rutledge saw the man standing at the tree line, she assumed he was a trick of the fog, just another shape the woods carved out to frighten the weak. The Rutledge estate had a way of bending shadows, stretching them thin until they crawled under doors and whispered through cracks. But this shadow didn't move with the wind. It breathed. It waited. And it watched only her. 4 generations, the Rutledge clan lived by a rule so old no one remembered its beginning. Every daughter must marry a cousin to keep the blood pure. It was tradition, they said. Duty. Protection. But to Eliza it was a cage built long before she was born, one that tightened each year she crept closer to womanhood. The house creaked with secrets, the portraits glared with inbred familiarity, and the halls smelled of something that felt less like family and more like rot hidden beneath lace and manners. The woods were the only place she could breathe. Everyone else feared them, their twisted branches, the strange hum that rose after sunset, the stories of those who wandered too far and returned not quite human in the eyes. But the woods felt alive to Eliza in a way the house never did. They felt like they knew her. Like they had been waiting. So when she saw the silhouette again, closer this time, close enough that she could make out the pale line of a face too still to be ordinary, she didn't run. She should have. Every instinct trained into her since childhood told her to turn back toward the house, toward safety, toward blood. Instead, she stepped forward, drawn by a pull she couldn't name. Something in the stranger's presence felt familiar, as though he belonged to the part of her she had been taught to suffocate. Behind her, the Rutledge mansion loomed with its windows glowing like watchful eyes. Ahead, the trees shifted, forming an opening that hadn't been there before. The stranger lifted his hand slowly, silently, and in that moment Eliza understood something she could never say aloud. For more than 7 generations, the Rutledge family clung to a tradition that grew darker each time it was repeated, a rule spoken in elegant tones but enforced with an iron grip. Every Rutledge daughter must marry a cousin to keep the bloodline strong. What began as a superstition whispered by an ancestor who feared the dilution of power eventually became the law of the household, carved into the very bones of the estate. The family justified it with stories of heritage, purity, and legacy, insisting that no outsider could ever understand the weight or worth of Rutledge blood. But beneath the polished explanations lay something far more unsettling, a quiet desperation to hide whatever corruption had already seeped deep within their lineage. They feared the world beyond their gates as though it held the key to unraveling them. Each daughter was raised on the promise that this duty was not a punishment, but a sacred bond. They were told that marrying within the family was an honor, a way to preserve the gift their ancestors carried. Gifts, however, do not usually cause nightmares, nor do they leave the daughters pale and fragile before their time. Yet generation after generation, the same patterns emerged: children born with uncanny resemblances, eyes too similar to distinguish, and a strange melancholy that settled over the house like dust that could never be cleaned away. The elders insisted this was simply the Rutledge look, but the local whispers called it something else entirely. Despite the mansion's grandeur and the wealth that insulated them from the outside world, the Rutledge women lived with little freedom. Every girl, from the moment she learned to speak, understood her future with a clarity that should have terrified her. Her husband already existed somewhere within the house, perhaps a few rooms away or in the estate's secondary wing. He might have been her playmate, her distant cousin, or the quiet boy whose eyes never quite looked in the same direction. It didn't matter. Her choice was an illusion, one carefully crafted to look like privilege while binding her to the same fate her mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother endured. The men of the family were raised to treat this ritual as their birthright. They carried themselves with a sense of entitlement that came from knowing every daughter was born for them, bred for them, and eventually promised to them. Love was irrelevant, compatibility unheard of. Only the blood mattered. The purity they worshipped had long since turned into decay behind closed doors, but none dared question it, not even the ones who felt a wrongness blooming in their veins. The result was a lineage that grew tighter and more twisted with each generation, a family tree whose branches curled inward instead of reaching toward the sun. Yet still, they clung to the belief that marrying outsiders would be the true ruin, never realizing the ruin had already taken root within themselves. The Rutledge estate stood like an old wound at the edge of the woods, a sprawling structure built from dark timber and stone that had weathered centuries of storms yet never lost its air of oppressive grandeur. Locals said the house was older than the town itself, its foundations laid long before any road, church, or school rose around it. At sunrise, the mansion looked regal and historic, but at dusk it took on a different face entirely, as though the shadows inside it pushed outward and stretched across the land. Even the path leading to its iron gates seemed unnaturally quiet, as if sound itself softened in the presence of the place. Travelers avoided it, children dared each other to run past it, and grown men refused to look too long at its windows, convinced something watched from behind the glass. What made the estate even more unsettling was the forest that bordered it. The Rutledge woods were dense, tangled, and infamous, a place where compasses spun without direction and familiar trails vanished overnight. The trees grew impossibly close together, their branches twisted into claw-like shapes that seemed to reach toward anyone foolish enough to enter. Strange sounds rose from the depths of the forest at night, low hums, distant whistles, and the occasional echo of something that was neither animal nor human. People who lived nearby claimed the woods moved, shifting subtly over the years, swallowing old hunting cabins and even a forgotten cemetery. No one could prove it, but no one dared challenge it either. The Rutledge family insisted that the woods were harmless, a mere backdrop to their estate, but they never ventured inside. Even the bravest among them stopped at the tree line, glancing over their shoulders as though something inside the mansion might drag them back if they strayed too far. The elders forbade the children from exploring the forest, warning them of dangers that were never fully explained. They spoke of the woods as if they were alive, as if they possessed a will of their own. And yet, they built their home right next to it, as though choosing to guard a secret buried in its roots. Visitors to the estate often remarked on the atmosphere, how the air felt heavier the moment they stepped through the gates. It wasn't the kind of heaviness that came from humidity or age, but something intangible, a pressure that settled on the shoulders and made breathing feel slightly more difficult. Even inside the house, the presence of the woods lingered. Every window facing the forest looked out onto a darkness that didn't change with the seasons, a darkness so still and deep it seemed to absorb the light around it. The isolation of the estate wasn't just physical, it created a psychological distance that separated the Rutledge family from the outside world. Their traditions, their fears, and their secrets all thrived within that separation, protected by the silence of the woods and the towering walls of the mansion. It was a place where time felt distorted, where days blended together and nights stretched endlessly, and where the truth of the family's legacy hid in the quiet spaces no one dared to explore. Eliza Rutledge entered the world during a storm so violent the midwife later swore the sky split open just to let her through. Thunder cracked over the estate in rapid, furious bursts, rattling windows and shaking portraits from the walls. The wind howled against the mansion as though trying to tear the roof free, and each flash of lightning briefly illuminated the halls in stark white, revealing the ancestors' faces contorted in frozen disapproval. It was on this night, when even the servants whispered prayers under their breath, that Eliza let out her first cry, a sound sharp enough to silence the storm for a single, impossible moment. Some said nature paused to listen. Others believed it recoiled. The midwife, a woman who had delivered dozens of Rutledge children and witnessed the strange frailties each generation carried in their blood, sensed something different the moment she held the newborn. Eliza's eyes were open, wide and unblinking, as if she were not learning the world for the first time but remembering it. They were an unusual shade, a deep mirrored grey that seemed to reflect more than the room around her. When the midwife handed her to the family elders, she hesitated before speaking the words that would follow the child throughout her life. "This one has the woods in her eyes." It wasn't meant as a warning, but the room stiffened as if it were one. The elders exchanged glances that brimmed with unease, for the Rutledge family had always feared what lay beyond their estate, and anything resembling the woods was treated with suspicion. Growing up, Eliza carried that storm-born aura with her. Even as an infant, she stared at things the others couldn't see, her gaze drifting toward the windows that faced the forest. She rarely cried, rarely fussed, but she watched, always watched, with a focus too intense for a child. Her mother claimed she could soothe animals with a glance, something no other Rutledge child had ever managed. Her father insisted she had nightmares before she even learned to speak, waking with silent tears and eyes fixed on the tree line as though something called to her in the night. The elders, unable to explain it, resorted to their usual remedy for anything that deviated from tradition. They tightened their control, determined to mold her into the same shape as every daughter before her. But Eliza did not fit. She seemed both part of the family and separate from it, as though the storm that birthed her had burned away whatever unquestioning obedience the Rutledge daughters were meant to inherit. There was a stillness in her, a quiet resilience that unsettled the household. She did not shrink from shadows, nor did she flinch at the creaks and whispers of the old mansion. If anything, the child seemed calmer when the world around her grew darker. When she looked at the woods, her expression softened in a way that filled the family with dread. They had long prided themselves on keeping the outside world at bay, but from the moment Eliza opened her eyes, it was clear the outside world, especially the woods, had already found its way into her. As Eliza grew older, the quiet pull she had felt since infancy began to shape her in ways the Rutledge family could neither predict nor control. While other children were taught to stay within the manicured gardens and stone courtyards of the estate, Eliza drifted toward the woods with an instinct that seemed older than memory. The trees whispered to her in the wind, their branches swaying in patterns she felt she understood even before she learned to read. Whenever she slipped away, the servants searched frantically, knowing the punishment for losing sight of a Rutledge daughter. Yet they always found her standing calmly at the tree line, watching the shifting shadows as though listening to a voice only she could hear. The family elders interpreted her behavior as defiance, though it was far from intentional. Eliza felt suffocated inside the mansion's walls. The heavy drapes, the dim corridors, the oppressive portraits of ancestors who looked far too similar, it all pressed in around her. The estate's air was thick, unmoving, as if the house itself resented every breath taken inside it. The woods, in contrast, felt alive. She wasn't afraid of the dark tangles of branches or the eerie stillness others claimed to sense. To her, the forest offered a freedom she never found indoors. Even as a child, she could slip beneath its canopy and feel a strange quiet settle in her bones, a peace she didn't know how to explain. Her mother tried endlessly to correct this behavior, scolding her with the same phrases Rutledge daughters had heard for generations. "Stay close to the house," she'd warn, voice lined with fear rather than anger. "Nothing good waits for us in those trees." But Eliza felt the opposite. Every rule her mother recited, every caution whispered in her ear, only deepened her fascination. She didn't understand why her family reacted with such panic to the idea of her stepping a few feet beyond the lawn. She only knew that the woods didn't frighten her. They felt familiar, as though they recognized her, welcomed her, and opened themselves to her presence. When she was 11, Eliza discovered a hidden trail behind the old stone well at the edge of the estate. It was narrow and overgrown, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. She followed it once, just far enough to realize the trees grew thicker and the air cooler. For the first time, she felt the world shift around her, a sensation like crossing into a different realm. She didn't go deeper that day, but she returned often, hovering at the entrance of the path, sensing that something waited just beyond sight. The elders noticed her restlessness. They whispered among themselves that the child was too curious, too connected to the one place the family feared above all others. They tightened the rules, doubled the supervision, and restricted her freedom. But each attempt to confine her only made the invisible thread tying her to the woods stronger. What they didn't understand was that Eliza's wanderings weren't rebellion. They were destiny taking shape, a silent promise between her and the forest that the Rutledge bloodline could not contain forever. Eliza was 14 the first time she realized she wasn't alone in the woods. It happened on an evening when the sun was sinking behind the treetops, staining the sky with fading streaks of gold and violet. She stood at the tree line, as she often did, feeling the familiar calm settle over her. But this time, something felt different. The air carried a strange stillness, the kind that makes animals freeze and listen. Even the usual rustle of leaves fell silent, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. Eliza didn't hear footsteps or breathing, she simply felt the presence and awareness brushing against her skin like a soft current. When she lifted her gaze, she saw him. At first, he was nothing more than a shadow, a tall silhouette partially hidden between two massive oaks. She didn't see a face or clothing, not even movement, just the unmistakable outline of someone watching. It wasn't the stance of a casual wanderer or a lost traveler. There was purpose in his stillness, an intensity that rooted her feet to the ground. Eliza's heart didn't race the way it should have. Instead, she felt an odd recognition, as though she had been waiting for this moment without knowing it. The figure didn't advance or retreat, he simply existed there, in a space where no sane person willingly stood after sunset. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Eliza felt a strange warmth rise inside her, not fear but something close to curiosity, mixed with a thread of instinctual caution. She blinked once, and the light shifted just enough to reveal the subtle lift of a head, like he was studying her in return. His posture wasn't threatening. If anything, it seemed almost gentle, aware of her presence in a way that felt unsettlingly intimate. Then, as the wind swept through the trees, his outline flickered, an illusion that made her question whether he was a real man or a trick of the dying light. When she finally broke her gaze to glance behind her, just for a second, the figure vanished. Not with a rustle of branches or crunch of leaves, but as if he had been swallowed by the forest itself. Eliza stepped forward, drawn by instinct, but the woods remained silent and still. No footprints marked the ground. No sign of disturbance lingered. Yet she knew what she had seen. Every part of her sensed it. Someone had been there, someone who moved with the forest rather than through it. Back at the house, the atmosphere felt even more suffocating than usual. The corridors seemed too narrow, the air too stale, the eyes in the portraits too heavy on her shoulders. She couldn't shake the impression of being watched, not by the walls, but by the memory of the figure whose presence had felt both haunting and strangely familiar. She didn't tell anyone. She couldn't. The Rutledge elders would have locked her away if they knew she had glimpsed something or someone in the woods. Yet that night, as she lay awake listening to the distant hum of the forest, she felt it again. A presence at the edge of her awareness. Not threatening. Not malicious. Just waiting. She understood then that their brief encounter wasn't an accident. It was the beginning of something the Rutledge family had never prepared her for, something the woods had kept hidden until she was ready to see it. By the time Eliza was 16, the Rutledge elders had grown increasingly uneasy with her fascination for the woods. Her wanderings, once dismissed as childish curiosity, were now seen as dangerous defiance. Every Rutledge daughter had followed the same path, tutored at home, kept under careful watch, and eventually married to a cousin to ensure the bloodline remained intact. No exceptions were allowed, and any hint of disobedience was punished with strict measures and the weight of centuries-old expectations. Yet Eliza's eyes continued to linger on the tree line, and her steps often carried her further than anyone could follow, testing the boundaries of what her family considered safe. Her attachment to the forest was no longer secret, and the elders began to whisper about the need to act quickly before she strayed completely from the line of duty. The house grew tense with anticipation. Servants whispered warnings in the hallways, their voices tight with fear, while the portraits of ancestors seemed to watch her every move with a judgmental stare. Her mother tried to steer her toward propriety, repeating the familiar words every Rutledge daughter had heard for generations: "Your duty is to the family, not to the woods." But the more her family pressed, the more Eliza's connection to the forest seemed to strengthen, as though the trees themselves were responding to her distress. It was this growing tension that led the elders to plan her first cousin as a suitor, a boy carefully selected from within the estate, someone who would conform to the family's long-held traditions without question. He was the embodiment of everything the Rutledge bloodline represented: familiar, predictable, and entirely under the control of the elders. Preparations began quietly at first. Tutors instructed Eliza in the arts of etiquette and refinement, emphasizing that she would soon be a wife and a custodian of the family's legacy. Wardrobes were arranged, and subtle conversations were held to remind her of her obligations. But the more the house tried to shape her into another obedient Rutledge daughter, the more evident it became that Eliza resisted. Her moods shifted unpredictably, and she spent hours staring out of windows toward the forest, her thoughts unreadable and her silence unnerving. Even the servants, long accustomed to the family's rigid order, sensed that this daughter was different. They feared the consequences of her rebellion but felt powerless to stop the inevitable clash between duty and desire. The elders, growing increasingly desperate, began speaking of urgency in hushed tones. Arrangements had to be finalized before Eliza's 18th birthday, before her wandering nature could become unmanageable. Every detail was scrutinized, from the timing of visits to the careful placement of relatives at social gatherings. They believed that a marriage to her cousin would restore order, align her with tradition, and sever whatever dangerous bond she had begun forming with the forest. But as the days passed, the house itself seemed to resist their plans. Strange sounds echoed through the corridors at night, doors creaked open without reason, and shadows moved where none should have been. The family sensed it but dismissed it as nerves, yet deep in the estate, it was clear that the line between control and chaos was thinning, and Eliza's path was already slipping from their grasp. One night, when the moon had hidden itself behind heavy clouds and the woods were swallowed in a darkness so complete it seemed unnatural, the figure emerged fully from the shadows. Eliza had wandered closer to the tree line than ever before, drawn by the familiar pull that had guided her steps for years. She felt the tension of the house loosen, as if the mansion itself was holding its breath in anticipation. The figure was no longer a fleeting silhouette but a presence she could define, tall, broad-shouldered, and moving with a fluidity that belonged neither to man nor beast. His clothes were simple, worn, and marked by the forest itself. Dirt and foliage clung to him in patterns that made it clear he had lived there far longer than anyone could imagine. Yet his eyes were what unsettled her most, pale, unyielding, and yet strangely reflective, as though they had seen the centuries pass and remembered each one in haunting detail. Eliza froze, her pulse quickening but her body refusing to retreat. There was something in his posture, in the subtle tilt of his head, that suggested he knew more about her than she did herself. He did not step forward, yet he was closer, somehow bridging the impossible distance between the forest's edge and her small, nervous steps. The air around him vibrated with an unspoken command, a quiet insistence that demanded attention without raising its voice. She sensed that he had been waiting, watching her for some indeterminate span of time, and that her coming to the forest that night was not chance but inevitability. The realization was equal parts thrilling and terrifying, and it rooted her to the spot as the shadows of the trees stretched long and dark around her. Despite the warning whispers of her family, Eliza felt no fear, only a strange sense of understanding that seemed to pass between them. The stranger's lips did not move, but his presence spoke in a language older than words, in tones that resonated deep in her bones. He gestured subtly, a tilt of the hand toward the forest path that seemed to open just for her, inviting her further into the unknown. And yet, it was not a beckoning of seduction or danger, it was something far more complicated, a challenge, an acknowledgement, a promise she could not yet grasp. The wind whispered through the branches, rustling leaves in tandem with the unspoken rhythm that pulsed between them, and the shadows seemed to bend, framing him as if the forest itself had fashioned him for this meeting. Eliza wanted to speak, to ask questions, to demand answers, but the words lodged in her throat. Instead, she remained still, watching him with an intensity that mirrored his own, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her chest. When a sudden gust of wind carried the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, she realized that he was not part of her world and yet, somehow, he belonged to her in a way no Rutledge ever could. The figure moved again, not forward, not backward, but with a rhythm that suggested patience measured in decades rather than minutes. Eliza understood, with a clarity that made her breath catch, that the stranger was the key to the life she had glimpsed only in dreams and the very thing that might break the chains her family had forged around her. Over the following weeks, Eliza found herself returning to the forest with a purpose she could not fully explain. The stranger's presence had shifted from something distant and mysterious to something compelling, as though the woods themselves had conspired to draw her closer to him. Each time she approached the tree line, she felt the tension of the Rutledge estate lift slightly from her shoulders, replaced by a strange calm that made the house's stifling air seem almost unbearable in comparison. The more she observed him, the more she realized he was not merely a wanderer lost among the trees. He carried with him an awareness that transcended ordinary understanding, a knowledge of the forest and its hidden paths that left her both awed and unsettled. There was a precision in the way he moved, a rhythm to his gestures, as though he had been trained by centuries of silence and solitude, yet every motion was purposeful and alive. Eliza's initial fear gradually faded, replaced by a fascination that bordered on instinct. The stranger never spoke in words, yet communication flowed between them in other ways, a glance that lingered too long to be accidental, a tilt of the head that suggested recognition of her thoughts, a gesture that seemed to offer understanding without explanation. She began to sense that he knew more about her family than anyone ever could, that he was aware of the hidden rot in the Rutledge bloodline and the oppressive weight of tradition that had suffocated each daughter before her. There was no malice in him, no hint of judgment, but an undeniable urgency in the way he seemed to warn her. The forest had preserved secrets the estate could not hide, and she was at the threshold of uncovering truths the Rutledge family would rather bury forever. Slowly, a bond formed between them, fragile yet undeniable. She found herself confiding in him without words, allowing her presence to speak what her lips could not. The woods, once a sanctuary in its own right, became a stage where understanding and trust could be nurtured, where the weight of centuries of obligation seemed lighter. The stranger guided her attention to subtle details, the way certain branches formed natural corridors, the faint tracks of creatures unseen, the hum of the forest that hinted at life beyond the visible. In these small observations, Eliza recognized a world her family had tried to blind her to, a dimension of existence that defied the rigid expectations she had been raised to obey. As the connection deepened, he revealed fragments of what he had witnessed, hints of the curse embedded in the Rutledge lineage and the consequences of adhering blindly to tradition. Every warning carried weight. It was as though he had seen the same patterns repeat for generations and understood the stakes with unerring clarity. Eliza began to grasp that the stranger was more than an anomaly in the forest, he was a living testament to the lives that had suffered under the family's unyielding rules. Each encounter drew her further from the house's suffocating walls and closer to a choice that would challenge everything she had been taught to accept, awakening a courage that the Rutledge bloodline had long sought to suppress. On the eve of her arranged marriage, Eliza felt the weight of the Rutledge estate pressing down on her more heavily than ever. The house seemed to hum with anticipation, its corridors alive with whispered instructions and furtive glances. Every adult in the family moved with the precision of a machine, ensuring that no detail of the ceremony could falter, no tradition be broken. They believed that by sunrise, she would be bound to her first cousin as had been the fate of every Rutledge daughter before her, and with that union, the family's order would be restored. Yet Eliza's mind was elsewhere, tangled in the memory of the stranger who waited at the edge of the forest, whose presence had become an unspoken promise she could no longer ignore. The call of the woods had grown impossible to resist, stronger than the walls, stronger than the weight of obligation, stronger than the fear instilled in her since birth. As the moon slipped behind clouds and the night deepened, Eliza made her decision. She moved quietly through the estate, careful to avoid the servants and relatives stationed in every hallway and courtyard. Each step she took felt monumental, as though the floorboards themselves whispered warnings beneath her feet. Her heart pounded not from fear of discovery but from the intoxicating rush of defiance, the thrill of stepping outside the meticulously constructed world her family had built around her. She reached the edge of the property where the manicured gardens gave way to the tangled undergrowth of the Rutledge woods. There, the darkness seemed to shift and bend, opening a path that had never appeared so clearly before. And there, standing silently amidst the shadows, was the stranger. Without hesitation, she stepped forward, letting him take her hand. His grip was firm but gentle, guiding her into the forest with a confidence born of long familiarity. The trees closed around them, swallowing the light and sound of the estate behind them. As they moved deeper into the woods, the oppressive weight of generations lifted slightly from her shoulders, replaced by a sense of belonging she had never felt in the grand halls of the mansion. The night air was alive with the scent of earth and leaves, thick with the quiet pulse of life unseen, and in that pulse, she felt the rhythm of something older than the Rutledge legacy, something that had waited patiently for her arrival. Behind them, the estate stirred in chaos. Shouts echoed faintly through the distance as the family realized she was gone. Servants scrambled, and elders commanded with frantic authority, but the night offered no path back to the mansion for those who sought her. She could hear their voices fading, replaced by the steady, grounding presence of the stranger beside her and the murmur of the forest around them. Every step carried her further from the predetermined life of duty and into the unknown, a life shaped not by bloodlines or obligation, but by choices born of courage, intuition, and the undeniable pull of the mysterious figure who had waited for her all these years. The Rutledge family, with all its traditions, wealth, and authority, had been left behind, and in that moment, Eliza realized that she was no longer merely a daughter of the estate, she was a force of her own making, moving into a world that promised both peril and freedom in equal measure. As Eliza moved deeper into the woods, guided by the stranger's calm, unerring presence, she began to understand the truths he carried with him, truths that the Rutledge family had spent generations concealing. The stranger was not merely a wanderer or an outcast, he was the last living witness to the consequences of the family's rigid obsession with bloodline purity. He spoke of cousins forced into marriages that produced fragile, twisted children, of women trapped in gilded cages where the walls were invisible but no less confining, and of men who grew cold and hollow, their humanity eroded by the repetitive cycles of control and secrecy. Every story he told, every detail he revealed, painted a picture of a legacy steeped in suffering and corruption, a heritage the Rutledge elders had mistaken for strength. The forest seemed to embrace his words, carrying them through the trees in a silent echo, as if confirming the reality that the estate had long denied. Eliza listened with a mixture of awe and horror, realizing that her rebellion was not merely an act of youthful defiance but a necessary confrontation with a lineage that had long outlived its moral compass. She saw the weight of generations pressing down upon her own body, the invisible chains of tradition that had been passed from mother to daughter, father to son, each link forged in secrecy and fear. And yet, standing beside the stranger, she felt the first taste of freedom, the possibility that she could break the cycle rather than perpetuate it. The realization was intoxicating but also terrifying, for to walk away from the estate and the only world she had known meant leaving behind safety, status, and certainty, stepping instead into a life that promised peril at every turn. The stranger, sensing her hesitation, did not rush her. He spoke in fragments, in glances and gestures, teaching her to read the subtle language of the woods, to move silently, to observe without being observed. He revealed hidden paths, safe places, and ancient markers left by those who had tried and failed to escape the Rutledge legacy before her. Each revelation deepened her understanding, each lesson strengthened her resolve, and each step away from the estate pulled her further into a new existence, one not dictated by blood or duty but by choice and awareness. As night deepened around them, Eliza felt the weight of the past and the urgency of the present converge. The stranger's gaze was steady, unwavering, and in it she saw the reflection of a possibility she had never dared to imagine, that she could survive the history of her family, that she could forge her own destiny, and that the forest, vast and unknowable, was not merely a hiding place but a crucible for transformation. He revealed that the curse of the Rutledge bloodline had not ended with her predecessors, it persisted quietly, threatening each life born under its shadow. Yet with him, she had the chance to defy it, to claim a future that was entirely her own, untethered from the darkness of her heritage, and for the first time, she understood that the stranger had not come for her by accident, he had come to offer her a choice between inevitable repetition and deliberate liberation.